Okay, I think it's high time that we start this event. And let me just say that good evening to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very special event, Veritas Forum. Before we introduce the subject and the speakers of today's discussion, let me briefly tell you about Veritas Forum and what is Veritas Forum. Basically, Veritas Forum is an independent, non-profit organization that organizes high-level academic discussion and debate regarding life's most profound questions. And this has continued for over 20 years, all over the world. Veritas Forum Finland works mainly with the student groups and organizations around different campuses around Finland. This time, Evankeliset opiskelijat OPKO and Kansan Raamattuseura KRS have been organizing this event. Each Veritas Forum discussion is unique and has different speakers on different topics. Usually the speakers themselves hold to various different worldviews. The Christian worldview is usually represented by at least one speaker. And now, let's get into the topic of today's debate. Our topic for today is, are human rights for all? Do all human beings have human rights? That is the question. And why? Why do we have human rights? I imagine all of our speakers today affirm that, yes, we indeed do have human rights. Maybe the reasons are different why we have them. Also, can we resolve all of our moral dilemmas using the idea of human rights? And can we rely on human rights as a sufficient framework for our common life? These questions and many more will be addressed during today's event. And next, I will introduce you our speakers this evening. David McIlroy, sitting on the middle. He's a barrister. He holds master's degree in law from the University of Cambridge, UK, and Toulouse, France, and the PhD of Theology of Law from the University of Wales. Davis practices as a barrister in the field of banking law and is a visiting senior lecturer in banking law at SOAS University of London, where he teaches the whole of the LLM course on banking law, sets and marks the exams. And he also supervises the master's dissertations. In 2011, David compiled a report on Albanian's banking legislation in preparation for its application to the European Union, a report prepared for the Albanian Ministry of European Integration and for the European Commission, involving 6 trips to Albania during the preparation of the report and working closely with the government departments and the central bank. He also supervises master's dissertations on the theology of law and justice at Spurgeon Theological College in London. David is an author of the book of A Biblical View of Law and Justice and a Trinitarian Theology of Law. David has spoken internationally on questions regarding banking law, money laundering, human rights, justice, natural law, and the dangers of scientific naturalism. Let's give a hand for David. Our next speaker is Jukka Viljanen, sitting on the right. Jukka is an adjunct professor of human rights law and university lecturer of public law at the University of Tampere. Jukka has been working as professor of public law and also professor in charge of public law group. He has been leading several important research projects recently for example, evaluation of Finnish Human Rights National Action Plan and Finnish Environmental Constitutional Right. He's also an expert for the Constitutional Law Committee of the Finnish Parliament and Ministry of Justice in matters related to the European Court of Human Rights. Most recently, he is appointed to the Ministry of Justice Expert Committee reviewing constitutional provisions related to secrecy of communications. Let's give a hand for Jukka. And to our final speaker, we have Paul Abbey. Paul is 50 years old, father of 7 children, and was born in Nigeria, where he lived until 1990. In Nigeria, Paul attended school, including university, where he got his bachelor's degree in physics and electronics. And from Nigeria, Paul moved to England, where he studied for master's degree in microelectronic sensors and intelligent instrumentation. While in England, he started a business writing computer software programs for businesses, which he continued until 2001. When Paul came to Finland because of her wife, whom he had met in England, Paul has also done work in the area of immigrant integration, and since 2003 he has been a member of the Jyväskylä City Council. Let's give a warm welcome to Paul. And now we could show the next slide, please. And here you can see the event structure for this evening. We will be opening with opening presentations by each of the speakers for 15 minutes. After that, we will have questions from each of the speakers to one another. After that, we will have general discussion and answers to questions around 10 minutes each. And we will also be having an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And finally, we will have a summary closure statement for 2 minutes each. After this event, there will be a coffee and casual free talk until 19:00, until that's when the event will end. And I will, there's also continuation of this event in Kasvisravintola Katriina at Kauppakatu 11. Also, I've been instructed to tell you that if you at any point want to leave this room, beware that there's a VIP event happening outside of the door. So try not to disturb them while you exit the room. No pressure. Yes, our moderator today will be Jose, and he will keep track of the time so that each speaker will have equal amount. And no, without further ado, let's get started with the first opening statement for Jukka.
All right, thank you. I hope you can hear me. It's very nice to be here in Jyväskylä. I was introduced very well, but one thing which I could mention as an addition that I have this sort of background from Jyväskylä. My grandmother was born here, and this sort of seminar in Mäki is that way important because her father was a teacher in Jyväskylä seminar, Nestori Järvinen. So that's my background for Jyväskylä. In my presentation, I try to give some issues about human rights law and why it's important. Also have this sort of European perspective. Here in the picture behind you see the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And it's a court which has been important in my career because I have done most of my research, which is written in English about this European Court of Human Rights. My dissertation and I've done also this sort of postdoc project for the Academy of Finland for 3 years on that subject. And visited many times in Strasbourg, and it's one of the sort of my second hometowns. And Strasbourg Court is important in being this sort of safeguarding of human rights in Europe, not just in Finland, but in 47 countries. 800 million people are protected under the convention. So it comes from Iceland until to the Pacific Ocean in Vladivostok, because the whole Russian Federation is also part of the European Convention on Human Rights. But why human rights law is important? I have done a lot of research on constitutional law, and human rights are the sort of counter force to fragmentation of law. We have a lot of this sort of detailed regulation, and human rights law is one which is giving this sort of basis, foundation. And every coherent system has to have built on strong basis of fundamental and human rights, and so are also the Finnish system. Finland, we have to make great this sort of change in 1990s. We had the previous recession at that time, but also on those days, part of our Europeanization, we became member of the European Union, we ratified the European Convention on Human Rights, but we also drafted the new fundamental rights in Finland, 1995. And it was unanimous. There was no this sort of division with government and opposition, but we had this sort of committee which was in full consensus over those rights. So there is, I resent these sort of ideas that human rights are part of some political group. They are for everyone, also in that sense. So it's not about left or right-wing issues. It's about for politicians all over the political spectrum. What is human rights is about, for me, it's the fighting against totalitarian regimes and abuse of power, and it's ongoing. In Finland, we consider often that it's not going to be in near us. It's somewhere far away. But just look around our borders, you can see that it's very near us. And it can also be that here in Finland we have this sort of situation where the abuse of power can easily happen. We have to have this sort of safeguards against these abuses. And all contemporary legal systems are built on respect of human rights, democracy and rule of law, and they are this sort of in combination with each other. And it's essential that all legislation, whether it's in the banking sector or whether elsewhere, it has to be compatible with the obligations coming out of human rights law. That's my understanding, and I think that's part of how I see the human rights law. And also courts and other authorities should be very much aware that they are not conflicting with our human rights obligations. So what happens in the refugee situation should be in compliance with our human rights obligations. I did this sort of evaluation of our Finnish Fundamental Rights National Action Plan, and I interviewed a lot of civil servants and other authorities. And one thing which I think was important for me, this sort of lesson, that understanding human rights requires that we recognize them. Many of these sort of authorities didn't recognize that they were dealing with human rights. For me, human rights are part of everyday life of society. So they can be found in all major issues of our contemporary society, not just somewhere else, but also here. That's one of these sort of lessons which I think you should remember. And it's for everyone, not just lawyers, but people will encounter human rights questions in their daily lives. Think about refugees, think about budget cuts, think about climate change. These are the really big questions. They are also very much the human rights questions. Surveillance, I was introduced as being part of this sort of committee who now goes into these sort of issues. What happens when we have these sort of new surveillance methods and are they in compliance with our human rights obligations? So it's very difficult to have this sort of balance between our need for security and our human rights. But we must be careful when introducing new competencies to authorities, so we must give a really this sort of clear rules also. European Convention on Human Rights is this sort of convention treaty with the most sort of robust system in the world. So we bring with the European Convention also good supervisory system with the European Court of Human Rights, and of course national courts. If national courts are not working, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg would be very much in danger. It cannot handle so much pressure from individual applications. And those problems with the court has been due to these sort of systems like in Russia and Turkey, where the local population no more trust on their own system. But in this preamble of the European Convention, you see what is the background of these sort of treaties. They are, of course, coming back to those that never again, what happened in the Second World War, we must not see never again in our European soil. And it also refers to this sort of idea that human rights are part of peace. It's part of this sort of democratic system. So they are all what we need in our understanding what is good society. And as mentioned here, there is this sort of heritage, European heritage, and the convention refers to that we are like-minded, have a common heritage of political traditions, ideals, freedom, and the rule of law. And it also refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made in 1948. So there is also this sort of common standard set by the world after the Second World War, which is in this convention text. But the convention must be read in light of present-day conditions. That's mentioned in this sort of couple case I made extracts here. Rancher case, for instance, was about human trafficking. How do we deal with the victims of human trafficking when they are sent to a country in false pretenses and they are part of this sort of sexual exploitation? We need these sort of instruments which have to be interpreted in light of present day because the world is changing, new mechanisms, new this sort of technologies give this sort of understanding what we need. And European Court is also keeping these sort of measures under review, having this sort of regard to the scientific and social developments. That's part of this sort of understanding. 1950, we understood something, but now we see a little bit different issues. For instance, if we consider how we relate to this sort of sexual orientation, in 1950, the people would be sent to prison or mental hospital when they had different sexual orientations. Now we understand it cannot be that, it's discrimination. Recently, John Dalhousie wrote on blog text writing about that European human rights are now under siege from all sides. And I think that's one of the sort of important messages, that we are maybe forgetting what we have achieved. We had a success story in Europe with human rights law, and now many politicians are finding it difficult to see what are the benefits of human rights. They are only seeing the negative issues of human rights. And there are this sort of populist movement which is questioning human rights law. And I think this is false. This cannot be continued. Human rights are not obstacles to creation and preservation of inclusive and prosperous societies. They are preconditions. I agree with that statement by John Dalhousie. He is head of Amnesty's European division, Amnesty International European division. But we must be really careful at these times, because as Dalhousie said in his presentation, there is this sort of idea that 2015 could be a turning point when we later see what happens in Europe. As a final issue, I have made this sort of 5 points to move forward, looking at what we need in European standard. First one is that we must follow the object and purpose of these treaties, and it's protecting individuals. But it's of course protecting individuals together in a society. And we must look for spirit of the convention. And the spirit of the convention is of course protecting human rights, protecting democracy, and these sort of issues. One of the issues which I favor is looking beyond Europe and looking at what happens in globally, looking at these sort of international trends. European is not in isolation, something what happens in the world, like in questions of surveillance or these sort of CIA flights with extraordinary renditions. They happen all over, and we must be aware what happens. Fourth, we have to avoid too contextual approach. So when European Court of Human Rights talk about Turkish context or Latvian context, we must be really careful, because the message goes all over, and it concerns 800 million people. So if somebody concerns 800 million people, it's important to listen what is happening. And finally, the fifth point which I want to make here is we have to have this sort of idea of network and dialogue. So we must look not just to this sort of states, but also to NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and their role is going to be important in understanding what human rights is. So they make a really good job in current Europe, working together with the individual applicants. So that's my 5 points, and we'll continue with David.
Let me begin by saying that I agree with almost everything that Jukka has said. I was speaking about human rights last year in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And I thought that the context I would be speaking in is one where we would be reflecting on the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. In fact, I arrived a week after the shooting at the Copenhagen synagogue. And so this is a message that was left with the flowers outside that synagogue. And what it says in a series of different languages is, "We want to live together." And it was extraordinary going to Denmark at that time to think about the importance of human rights as a way of enabling us to live together. Now, my problem, I think, with human rights is that we have at the moment an approach, I think, that focuses far too much on the law and the lawyers. And as Jukka has already said, the problem with that is that we are in a time where politicians find it expedient to violate human rights, where the people who tend to invoke human rights are the very worst people we can imagine. Anders Breivik, the Norwegian serial killer and racist, making his Nazi salute as he goes along to complain that his human rights have been violated by being held in isolation, which has put him off carrying on with his studies at the University of Oslo, which he's doing. Interestingly, following the BBC website, we have somebody in the UK, a female killer who killed 3 people and tried to kill 2 others, who again has been held in isolation, making very, very similar sorts of arguments. And for a mass media which in the UK is hostile to human rights in many ways, these are the examples of what is wrong with human rights. And of course those two things feed populist politicians who are, for their own reasons, looking to get round human rights, rely on these kinds of arguments. And I think as well, all of that overlays onto a context of how we respond in times of crisis. We have been living with an economic crisis caused mainly by the bankers in the UK and in the USA, but which has had significant and ongoing impacts around the world, not least in countries like Finland. And when things get difficult, when it's tough, it is all too easy to huddle into groups of people like us. So that's the context that we face. And what do we do about it? Well, there was a man who was held for 7 years in a concentration camp by the Nazis. And he described how the Nazis took control and silenced opposition to their regime. And he said this: "First they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. It didn't matter that the rights of socialists, the freedom of speech of socialists was being violated because I was not a socialist. It did not affect me. Well, then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. It didn't affect me. It was somebody else who was being affected. Well, then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out. Why not? Because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me." This man was Pastor Martin Niemöller. He was a German Lutheran pastor. He was originally a supporter of Hitler. He was somebody who realized very early in the 1930s the consequences that were to come with the Nazi regime, so he switched, he became a vocal opponent, and he did eventually end up 7 years in a concentration camp, because one by one, different groups, people who were different, people who didn't think like their regime, were silenced. So why do these sorts of horrible atrocities occur? Well, I think in order to violate another human being's human rights, you have to convince yourself that your victim is not a human being, or at least not a human being who counts. The horrors of Nazi Germany, which was supposed never to happen again, happened in 1994 in Rwanda. In Rwanda, we saw somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people killed in 3 months. Not gassed, in some technologically advanced way, but hacked to death with machetes. How does that happen? Or how are the victims described by the killers? They were described as cockroaches, as insects. No longer humans, but somehow members of a different species. Within Europe, we saw in 1995, we saw the massacre in Srebrenica, 8,000 Bosnian Muslims killed by Bosnian Serbs. How? Because somehow belonging to a different religion meant that they did not count when it came to evaluating and acting. It is against that human rights theory insists all human beings have equal fundamental worth, that some human beings are not worth less than others, and absolutely stands against the idea that there are human beings who are completely worthless. But how do we make that effective? It's wonderful having all these laws. I'm really, really glad, though, that we have Paul speaking today. Because if human rights are to be defended, it cannot be left just to the lawyers. Just as politics is too important to leave to the politicians, defending human rights is too important to leave to the lawyers. And one of the things that we need to understand, particularly in our societies that are highly regulated, and particularly perhaps in Finland, where I noticed that you all obey the rules. It's extraordinary for somebody from the UK to come to a country where people wait for the light to go green before they cross the road. Yeah, you are like the Germans in that, but not like the French or the English, where we just walk across the road regardless and expect the cars to stop for us. So in a society that is used to following the rules, it is very easy to get the idea that the rules themselves will deliver. Our culture in the UK is very, very different. We are the world's financial centre. Between 2001 and 2008, there was one particular type of product that was sold to small businesses called an interest rate swap. 100,000 of those products were sold by the banks. There were very detailed rules about how they were supposed to be sold. The banks broke the rules in 90% of the sales. That's not because the rules didn't exist, it's because the rules got in the way of the bank's objective, which was making a profit. Law follows culture. If you want your laws to be effective, if you want human rights to be effectively defended in Finland and protected and available for everyone, you need not just good human rights laws, your excellent 1995 Fundamental Act, you need as well a popular culture which is broadly supportive of human rights. And this is where I think it gets interesting. Because one has to ask how one gets to that popular culture. Where does it come from? And I think there are really three choices. One approach you can take is to say that there are particular things that are great about human beings. Our ability to reason, our ability to communicate, perhaps in cultures other than Finland, our ability to smile and to laugh. But there are these things that are great about human beings, and that human rights exist to protect these. Another approach we could take is we could say, well, human rights just exist because they exist. The United Nations declarations of which Jukka referred to, the peoples of the United Nations have reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights. He had in his slide up the European Convention 10 years later, where the nations reaffirm their profound belief in fundamental freedoms. Two key documents in human rights history, both of which refer to belief and to faith. But faith in what? Faith in human rights. Thank you. Or we say, well, human rights exist because there's something about human beings, that they've been made by God. That's a theistic defence of human rights. Well, if you take the capabilities approach, you run into an interesting question. There are some things that are great about human beings, but there are some human beings who don't have the capacity to reason, those with Alzheimer's, for example, who don't have the capacity to communicate, those in a coma. So maybe we need to lower our bar a little. And if we lower our bar a little, well then maybe some apes have capacity. We have in the United States an application made to court in 2013 by the United States Non-Human Rights Project, arguing that 2 chimpanzees, a gorilla and an orangutan all had sufficient capacity and capabilities to be recognised as legal persons. I find this approach frankly sizist. My particular ape that I'm fond of is the gibbon, which is just smaller, that's all. A question in a Finnish context, would Moomins have human rights? I wonder. Well, if human rights just exist because they exist, then what? Our problem, if they come from governments, is what governments give, governments can take away. You could, in theory, if you had a consensus amongst your politicians, reform your fundamental law on human rights. And yet the very thing that we want human rights to do is to restrain totalitarian governments. Well, if human rights exist because our societies just seem to work better, we take a functionalist approach, forget the big theory. Human rights just work. Our societies work well with human rights. That's fine until the point where they don't seem to be delivering benefits anymore. When the cost gets too high, at the moment of stress, the point you need them most, they break down. Okay. And if we say they exist just because we exist, what do we say to the person who says, well, I'm a Darwinian, I follow Nietzsche, I think that really it's strength that is important. It's strength that matters in nature, the strong rule the weak. Why should we take a different approach in our civilization? Atheist philosopher, he's English, I apologise for that, but atheist philosopher John Gray says this: human rights originate in monotheism, the belief that there's only one God who creates a single moral law for all human beings. Unless human rights are grounded in something beyond the human world, they can only be a human invention. And you can trace the line through history. You trace the line through history from the UN Declaration on Human Rights back to the American Declaration of Independence, which says we hold as self-evident that all men are created equal. Thank you. And you trace it from the American Declaration of Independence back to another English philosopher, a man called John Locke, who makes the claim that all men and women have fundamental rights because they are created by God. That's the analysis done 5 years ago by New Zealand philosopher Jeremy Waldron in a book called God, Locke and Equality. He looks at the origin of the liberal tradition, our fundamental understanding in the West of fundamental equality, and he says unequivocally that is given to the liberal tradition by this man, John Locke, and he is getting it from his understanding of Christianity. And Christianity really gets there in 3 ways. Firstly, in common with all monotheistic religions, it says all human beings are made by the same God and subject to the same moral law. Secondly, in common with Judaism, it says that men and women were made in the image of God. They have something special, some sort of dignity on which rights supervene. And thirdly, it gets it specifically because of the story we tell at Christmas and Easter. We don't tell a story about a God king who comes in a palace. If that was the kind of narrative we had, we'd know that kings were more important than shepherds. We tell a story about someone who came and identified with the poor and with the weak, and who was an immigrant, who fled persecution as a child with his parents taken to Egypt, who then comes back, relates to women in a way that's scandalised, relates to foreigners, relates to criminals, and treats everyone he meets with dignity. And so we have that example that is given to us in the West, which undergirds our understanding of human rights.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to come and speak here. I haven't prepared any slide. I just felt it would be good to connect to people by just talking to them. I'd like to thank the first two speakers. It was absolutely great, and almost everything you spoke about are things I agree with. But what I wanted to do was to bring this down to the level. It was fantastic. David said it's good that a lawyer is not here to talk about law things and legal things. Well, law is very important, and I'll come to that later on. It is extremely important because it defines culture. And you hinted that culture is what affects people, and you talked about David, that is, talked about how the culture in different places differ as a result of the law. Okay. As a result, the rules that come out, laws are different. So my basic question is, or the place I'd like to begin with is the very, very basic question. What are human rights? How do we understand human rights, or what do we think it to be? I'm sure if we ask this to everyone in this room, we'll probably come up with different sets of answers for this definition. But it's good, I think, to start from here, because this is where probably we begin to understand. Jukka, whilst he was speaking, spoke brilliantly about the fact that this touches our everyday lives. So whatever we do, you have to take time off here now. I don't know, I mean, I think I can project. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. For the video, okay, in that case. Okay, is this better now?
You want to use this?
Okay, hello? Yeah. So, yeah, I'll say that Jukka had brought out the point that this is something that touches our everyday lives. And so I think it is very, very, very important that everyone has some sort of idea of what this is. Because I think, you know, like without this understanding, it is easy, very easy to be led into the situation where if someone is breaking someone else's rights, we go with the group and say, okay, that's what everyone is doing. Which unfortunately is what I notice is happening here in Finland today with the issue of the asylum seekers. They're slowly beginning to be regarded as not of the same quality as people who live here. And they're being talked about, and people jump onto that. And I think that just simply comes from the fact that people don't understand this basic question of what are the rights of people, and do they belong to everybody? So I have a definition for human rights. The way I see human rights is, or the way I would define human rights is that human rights are a framework or a concept that has been designed to protect the freedoms of people. And I'll speak a bit about this. So again, I'll repeat. They are a framework or a concept that are designed to protect certain freedoms that people have. So if we take the issue of freedoms, if we begin with the issue of freedoms, well, I would say, if I may quote Rousseau here, Rousseau said, everyone is born free. I agree with that, because we're free to do whatever it is we want to do. However, our freedom in being able to do whatever we do has an impact on the people we relate with, or could have an impact on the people we relate with. So how could this have an impact? Well, I could have a relationship with her where she is not satisfied at the end of the relationship. It means that I've done something in this relationship that's come out from me which has affected her in a way she is not happy with. Now, if she's not happy with that and we want to protect her not being happy with that, what we do is we give her the freedom to that happiness. But in giving her the freedom to that happiness, at the same time what we do is we restrict my freedom to break that happiness. That's one way we could look at human rights. That they provide freedoms for people, but in providing freedoms for people, they restrict freedoms, other freedoms as well. So I'll give the example of, say, the right to life. Let's look at the right to life. Everyone has a right to life. So we all should live. Now, at the same time, people could be said to have the freedom to kill. Because we do. And some people actually exercise that freedom. But if we're saying that we want to protect someone's life, what automatically we're doing is restricting the freedom for someone to kill another person. So what we're doing here now is we're saying that we're protecting certain freedoms, but in protecting certain freedoms, what we're doing is we're restricting certain freedoms as well at the same time. And this is where the law becomes very important, because the law should, if it's working, be able to protect these issues. Now, are they universal is another question that comes to mind. Are human rights universal? Because, like in both Jukka and David's speech, they talked about, like they hinted on and talked about the universality of these rights, that they should belong to everybody. Well, I believe that the rights are inherent in every one of us. So again, let's take the example of, let's use a basic example. Again, the right to life. Someone has a right to life. Now, included in that right to life is the fact that someone is not supposed to be hungry, because if you're hungry or you go without food for a certain period of time, what would happen is you would die, your life will be taken. So people should have, like as part of the right to life, should have adequate nutrition, adequate food, adequate something to eat. Now, is hunger limited to one person, or does everyone feel hunger when they're not given food, is the question we should ask. If we were looking at it from the point of view of universality. I would dare anyone to tell me that there is a human being on earth who would stay days or weeks without food and not feel hungry. From that point of view, it is inherent in all of us. All of us have this. Whether we want to have it or not, or whether we like it or not, it is just inherent in us. From when we're babies, if a baby doesn't get food, they scream, and the mother knows that they're hungry. This is something we all have inbuilt in us. So my view very strongly is that human rights are inherent, that we all have human rights. Now, which means that what I'm saying is there's a universality of this concept. Now, that universality, what it does is it says that regardless of where you come from, regardless of who you are, you have these things that should be protected. Now, that's something I believe in as well. Because looking at it from that point of view, I think we all are at some level the same. Regardless of the fact that we don't smile here. So the next question that comes up is, are rights universally protected? If we assume that they are inherent in us, like they're universal to all of us, are they universally protected? And that's where I guess the problem comes. For that, it's very, very easy to say that there is no country in the world that protects fully the rights of people. There's no region in the world, there is none. Why I say that is if you go to the court here, which is about 500 meters, 700 meters from here, and sit down, you'd hear case after case coming, and a lot of those cases affect the abuses of human rights. So regardless of what we might think, that some despot somewhere in the Congo or somewhere, like he's not protecting the rights, the abuse of rights happens everywhere. Very, very importantly, Jukka also mentioned that he hinted on what the possibilities are, what the responsibilities are. For me, I see that each and every one of us has a responsibility. And till we bring it to this level where people really understand this concept of rights, and that on a daily basis we interact with people in such a way that it is possible to break their rights. And this breaking of rights and these abuses of rights is not something that happens in a remote area that doesn't connect to us. Still, we understand this. We'd still be having this, conversation. But very, 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 very simply, if you look at the system around the world, if I return to whether rights are universally protected or not, there we see very clearly that, we have a system, and we live within a system that is designed, unfortunately, not to protect the rights of people. It's an unfortunate system. Now, as the person who was introducing said, I come from Nigeria, so I come from a country that's not Europe, and I understand what it means, to have to see human rights abuses. Now, how are certain rights protected? Well, the use of natural resources is a normal indicator on whether or not rights are protected. So, if there's enough food to feed everyone, and everyone does get fed, that's at least one right protected. We know that, like the right to life in some way is being met. Now, okay, so if we look at the world, the system inside which we live in is such that it's been designed such that the legal system that we have, the international legal structure, comes from the United Nations. Now, if we look at the United Nations and look at the people who actually make the laws, they are made in the Security Council. In the Security Council of the United Nations, we have 5 permanent members. Now, these 5 permanent members have the right to veto. That means if every other person says something, every other person in the world says something, one of those countries could come and say, hey, I do not agree with this. And that's the way it stays. So that's one thing, like when we look at the structure of how it is systematic. Another thing comes directly from, again, a UN report. A UN report in 1998, the UNDP, Human Development Report, states very clearly the system we have in the world. I'm worried about the time. Anyway, what it says there is that 20% of the human population consume 86%. Like consumption is 86%. That was in 1998. Now, to put that in perspective, it means that the remaining 80% are left to live with 14%. You could look at it that way. Right there is the systematic problem we have. We also have, in addition to that systematic problem, the things that support that systematic problem, where you have the Security Council I hinted on, and other structures that are designed to ensure that that system is in place. So, for example, we go to the shop here, we pick up chocolates. A lot of us don't know where the chocolates come from. Well, it's probably somebody slaving, like getting a child slave in Ivory Coast, because 70% of the chocolate comes from there. So there's this interconnectivity, and it's a system inside of which we live in, which we have to really look at when we look at these things. If we can look at it, and I believe we can, if we can educate ourselves and look at it, then we'd have the will, to be able to make the change where human rights can be granted to everybody. That's something I think that is worth looking at. I'll just summarize more. Maybe I could add a couple of sentences to give me more time. Also, if you look at the wars that are being fought nationally, people talk about the end of colonialism. Well, the whole colonial structure is part of that systematic abuse of rights, the thing that leads to systematic abuse of rights. It's very difficult nowadays to say that, like the invasion of Iraq, for example, is something that was legal, it's not legal. Everyone knows now it's, clearly something part of the colonial system where the resources are, being taken away from that place. And it is actions like that that go unpunished, that give the next generation of leaders, political leaders, the impetus to continue in that line. That is one of the stumbling blocks, in my opinion, of the abuse of, of the stumbling blocks that could stop, the end of human rights abuses. So I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Okay, so next you'll have 10 minutes time to comment on each other's opening speeches. So is there someone who wants to start? So should we just go Jukka first? And you want to go first? Yes. So 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Both of these opening speeches were really interesting, and just wanted to comment on David first. I think one thing what is sort of idea of how individualistic this sort of our human rights position is. You wrote it that more on your article, but I think that's one of the sort of important questions. For me, at least, human rights always bring together obligations, and it was mentioned also by Paul about these sort of responsibilities which are included in human rights. So, for instance, freedom of speech. Everybody of us knows that there are certain type of speech which is forbidden. The hate speech, of course. We have nasty examples at this time, talking about, for instance, about asylum seekers, what is happening, and even those who defend them are attacked. So that's one of the sort of important questions that we understand that human rights are also bring obligations on the people, and I think it's important. And also, of course, it's about governments who should consider how they make their laws, that the laws are also protecting people. They are ensuring that people who are, for instance, working in these sort of refugee centers are not attacked, and all these sort of issues which are coming out today in the media. It's there should be quick response, not just from media, but also the politicians should be really careful not to make this sort of situation even worse. Because it's of course nice to have this sort of populist opinion and consider that there are these sort of dangers, but I think the sense of security is also when people in high places understand that despite this sort of crisis situations, we have so many things which are working, and human rights is part of this sort of good achievements in these sort of European societies. So we must not destroy this sort of work which has been here for several years. And what was good in both these sort of presentation was that it's not about the lawyers, but it's you all who need to realize what are human rights and what is your own responsibility. You should recognize these sort of issues. It's in a school when child are harassed. It's a human rights question. It's when you meet people who are poor. How do you respond to them? It's these sort of questions where everyone has their own obligations to consider these issues. I think this is this sort of short. I think it's better if we have this sort of short comments and then continue with questions and answers. Yeah, thanks.
One of the things I think that happens when you come and speak in a different culture is that sometimes you come and you tell people what their problems are, and you discover that really you're talking about your problems. That's particularly true, I think, of people from those countries that consume 86% of the world's resources, going to developing nations, telling them that they need to stop burning so many trees and cutting down various other bits and pieces to solve a problem that we have created and not them. And when I have been touring Finland, I came to talk about a particular problem that I see with the way in which human rights theory is understood. And what I have discovered is that it is an English problem, or at least an English-speaking problem. And that is that English speakers understand rights as things which belong to individuals. And that makes the Anglo-American understanding of rights incredibly individualistic. It encourages selfish behavior and narcissism and consumerism, and it's very problematic. I've discovered that for all sorts of reasons to do with the very different philosophical influences on Finland, that you have a much better understanding of the way in which rights have to be balanced against obligations than the English and the Americans do. So we've heard it both from Paul's emphasis that human rights provide freedoms, but they do so in ways that restrict other people's freedoms. So your freedom is my obligation. And again, from Jukka's comments, it's self-evident here. Please hang on to that. I discovered that one of the reasons why you think like this is because of the influence of a man called Samuel Pufendorf, who was a German, but he taught in Lund in Sweden, and he wrote a big work which had an enormous influence called On the Duty of man and citizen back in 1682. So if I dare to say this to Finns, please be more Swedish and less British in your understanding of human rights. Paul also mentioned Rousseau, who said, "Man is born free." That's half the quote.
I don't.
I know Paul knows that that's half the quote. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains.
Chains, that is correct.
And I think we have to take that as an indication that the fight to maintain human rights is unending. We cannot, I think all three of us are saying, you cannot say, well, once upon a time in 1958, we in Europe came up with the European Convention on Human Rights, and we've been keeping it up to date with the European Court on Human Rights, and so we've kind of made it. That isn't the case. I think there's some very interesting questions. I'd like to hear Jukka on more about when he says we should be looking beyond Europe in terms of developing human rights going forward. Does he just mean to the easy place, which is the the United States of America or
Canada,
the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or does he mean also to some of the more challenging issues that are thrown up by what human rights means in an African context, by what it means in an Asian context, even by what it means in an Australian context with their particularly problematic treatment of the Aboriginals that they are still coming to terms with, or the way in which the British tricked the Maoris. One of the least glamorous parts of the UK's colonial past, which has many dark moments, is that with the Maoris in New Zealand, they entered into a treaty which has two versions. There's an English translation and a Maori translation, and they mean different things. So what the Maoris thought they were signing up to in the Treaty of Waitangi is not what has been enforced in the English version. My third comment. Paul said he believes that human rights are inherent in every one of us. You heard a little about his background in writing computer programs. One of the best accounts of human rights that is out there at the moment is by the American Christian philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff in a book called Justice, Rights and Wrongs. And the best way of explaining what he says to you is that rights are like bundled software. Just as when you buy your computer and turn it on, it works because there are things that are pre-installed that make it work. So human beings, because they are the type of thing that they come with rights pre-installed, and you cannot remove them from human beings. They're not given by governments. Governments are there to recognize them, but they are inherent.
Thank you. Starting with David is just absolutely brilliant. The way you looked at the different cultures and the way different cultures look at things. When I first came here, it was amazing to me the way society just followed the rules, because I had 25 years of Nigeria, then I had 12 years of England, and in both places could be compared to each other. Basically, when someone creates a rule, everyone asks, why? Does it really concern me? You know, like, am I involved in this? So coming over here to Finland, it was just such a different outlook. And both, David in particular mentioned the great thing that we have here in Finland, which I think we're beginning to lose. The great thing we have here in Finland is, we talked, all of us talked about human rights, and the fundamental thing about it is that there is equality, that human beings are born equal. And that is a fundamental principle that I think started out here after the war, the Second World War in Finland here, that the system, the whole system was based on creating one, that people are equal. That is something, in my opinion, that has definitely got to be defended. I came to Finland 14 years ago. This year is going to be the 15th year. And there's a huge difference. In the Finland I came to in 2001 and in Finland today, we now unfortunately have a classed society here. When I came to Finland, it was a classless society. And David again pointed out that we should be going and looking at Sweden, not looking at Britain or the United States. But unfortunately, our politicians are looking at the United States and they're looking at Britain to get the examples. Those societies are not based on equality, and the system here has been based on equality. I just also like to mention something very, very important, I think that Jukka said, which is it's related to education. Now, the concepts of human rights, in my opinion, are concepts that, if they are created and they are not reinforced and they are not in our everyday life, Jukka talked about it being as a part of our everyday, which means, to me, the way I see this is we need to constantly be educating ourselves on this, educating whoever we come across, our children and everybody, on this subject, so that it becomes something that is alive. If it is not, we forget it. And when we forget it, there are consequences. Jukka again pointed out that policies are being carried out today. If you look at the policies that are being carried out today by the government right now and the government before it, they are policies that actually create divisions in society. They actually break the rights of people in society. And that's what's happening. And the reason I think that this is happening is that, well, there are two things. One is our cultures always complain. So if something disturbs me, I can't keep my mouth shut. I've got to talk about it, and I've got to say, no, you cannot do this. No, you cannot do this. But films have this culture where everyone is quiet and then there is general consensus. I think people, first of all, have got to be aware that these things have an impact, and the impact that they have. And then also not just being aware, we've got to go from being aware to doing something about it. To say, hey, you cannot do this because this is going to affect me in this way, which is negative, and I could be an abuse on my rights. So that's something very important, I think, that came out of this. And there's something else David said I thought was very, very, very important, but somehow it's gone away from my memory. I was trying to keep it in memory. It'll come maybe later.
Yeah, thanks. We still have some good time, like 15 minutes for this discussion, but I would just like to answer also, like you all agree on like that everybody has human rights, has the right for freedom, all these things, but then I'm also like, could you also comment on like why? Because that's also one of the questions here. Would like to get some answers. You can also continue this, but what I'm also would like to hear about this more. Yeah. So.
I think we all answered that there is also this sort of history, never again, that what happened in the Second World War and these sort of atrocities should not happen again. But we see, as David explained, that we see time and time again these sort of renewals of these issues. And it gives us back one of these sort of issues which I'm really concerned that is our this sort of human rights culture still this sort of surface, and it's not in deeper in our society. So when bad things happen, we are too ready to give up on human rights, and that's really the sort of dangerous development. Another thing, maybe I can comment on what David asked me about looking a little bit outside of Europe and these sort of international trends. I think in this context, I'm of course looking a little bit how he mentioned easy places, but places where issues what is important in Europe can be improved. So, for instance, questions about indigenous peoples. Those issues are very well established in inter-American system. So you can use these sort of arguments from there. And when we go to these sort of countries like Canada and also in some sense USA, we have these sort of court cases which gives us a lot of information, a lot of these sort of ideas how to interpret the human rights. And we must be this sort of idea that we constantly seek new ideas from all over the world, which would improve our standards, not going downgrading our human rights standards, but getting these sort of new innovations that's important that we see that we are not in isolation. It's also in the sort of Finnish systems that we were in isolation for too many years before we entered into this European Convention on Human Rights, and we have severe problems. We didn't understand them. But when we get through our legislation and understood, for instance, how long this sort of when you were in this sort of investigations by the police, how long you could be apprehended before you get to the court. These sort of times schedules were really this sort of problematic in Finland before we joined the European Convention on Human Rights. So when you are in isolation, then you don't recognize the sort of development in human rights, and that's one of the sort of important look also what happens elsewhere and seek these sort of improvements.
It's always a joy to share a platform with people who are fundamentally committed to human rights, as Paul and Jukka so obviously are. There's a philosophical tool known as inference to best explanation. So where you have a phenomenon that is acknowledged, in this case the existence of universal and inherent human rights, you have to ask what is the best account that can be given of that. I think as well you also have to ask what is the account that is most likely to withstand pressure in times of stress. And as I indicated briefly in my presentation, I think there are a number of different accounts you can give. You can give an account based on human capabilities. You can give an account that is essentially positivistic, that says they just are, and we don't open the box and have a look and ask why they are. Or you can give an account which says that they are because they have been given to human beings because they're made by God. And each of us, I think, has to make up our mind which one of those accounts we find most convincing. And in practical terms, we need to defend human rights, those of us who come from different positions. Because when it gets to the level of how we ought to treat one another, I would much rather be in a society with people who all agree that there are fundamental inherent human rights but disagree about why, than in a society where actually the major debate is, do these things exist at all? Are there some people who don't really count as human? Are there some circumstances in which the will of the majority can override the will of the minority? Which was the dominant thinking amongst philosophers before the Second World War, and which made possible some of the tragedies that had occurred and which we said must never occur again.
Yes, I think, thank you both, Jukka and David. The thing I forgot to mention, which I thought was very important in David's speech, just came to mind. It was this Nemola quote, which said that the first came for a certain group of people, socialists, and then I said nothing. And it continues to eventually ended up with him. Now, I think that that's so important from the point of view of anyone who is interested in the progress of society in moving forward, that we've got to say things. I mentioned a little bit when I was talking that we have the responsibility, but the responsibility was clearly painted very, very, very starkly in that quote, that we have the responsibility. Going to this issue of where they come from, I think if you look back in history, people have always sort of thought about these issues, and people have always sort of thought about how to live with each other. Which brings me to a point I forgot to mention when I was talking, which was, why do we have human rights? Now, one way, the way I look at it, a bit like David is, he said quite brilliantly just now, that he would rather live in a society where it is given that everyone assumes that they're given, and then begin to debate as to, like, whether or not, or how, how do you come about it being given. Now, if you look at the bottom of human rights, I think there are two things probably it tries to do. The first is that it tries to create peace amongst people who live with each other.
Yeah.
So it tries to make sure that everyone is at peace with itself. Well, then you ask yourself, what are the issues that could give rise to people not being at peace? Well, definitely if someone is hungry and goes without food, that person cannot be at peace with himself. That's very clear to me at least. Now, why would that person not be at peace? Because if the person passes by the kitchen of someone who has food, and the person knows that they're going to probably die, they've not eaten for 2 days, the chances are very high that you go into that kitchen and, if it is possible, get the food to eat. It's a normal human reaction that we try to protect ourselves, try to secure ourselves. So that's one of the purposes of this concept, this framework of human rights. The second thing is that it tries to make sure that all of us have a good quality of life. And I'd like to find out who does not want to have a good quality of life. A number of years ago, there was an economic professor in Helsinki, Paul Rank, he shares the same name as me, who had said in an interview on television that someone pointed out that there was a difference being created in society where the rich in Finland were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, and he made the statement that he felt that that was good and that was something that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Finland. And well, I had to question that. I had to write to him and ask him whether or not there was something called development, that from his argument it would mean that before the discovery of penicillin, like people died from bacterial injuries. It means that, like you're saying, we should take back the development that has happened and allow people to have open wounds and die just because they have a cut. Is that where we want to go? So development has sort of happened. But going back to the history is such that, as I was saying, most societies probably at some point have thought about this. David in his speech mentioned the American Declaration of Independence, rights mentioned there. But before then, you had the Magna Carta. And before then, and that's looking at the European or Anglo-American, from the Anglo-American point of view. But if you go back, way back as 593 before Christ, in Persia, today, currently Iran, there was a Cyrillic script that has been found out, which was the very first manuscript for human rights. So these things are not restricted to just one region. I think as long as people have lived around the world, people have thought about how can they live with each other in peace. And the bottom line of all of this is that if you create a system where the basic needs and the basic wants of people are taken care of, there will be peace.
Okay, now we could have some questions. Does anyone have anything to ask from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, just a reminder before we go to audience questions. If you're not aware, this event is being filmed. So, if you don't want your face in YouTube, please refrain from asking the questions. Or maybe you can ask them. Maybe you can ask them after this event. So, yeah, if everyone is aware of that, then they can indicate as a show of hand, and I can give you the microphone for questions. Anyone?
I think that it's very important that the people know each others. I have heard that, for instance, in Congo, the Belgian kings didn't want them by roads, and there were people living so separate of each others. But and I know that in Tanzania, it's a very different country. My sister has been there working in Lutheran hospital from 81, and in that hospital there was also workers, Muslim workers, and they are living together, and they are maybe they are not that kind of. There are two Hutus and Tutsis. They are very many small groups, and they are living together there. They know each others, and they are living in peace.
East Africa in particular is a tale of two different countries, one of which is Kenya and the other one of which is Tanzania. And in Kenya it is well known that which tribe you belong to affects your chances of succeeding in Kenya, as a result of which tribal politics remains very strong within Kenyan democracy, and there's a high level of tension and insecurity. By contrast, in Tanzania, which, as you say, is a country with people from a number of different tribes and with Christians and Muslims there, they have done a much better job of nation building. They have done a much better job of treating everybody who is Tanzanian equally, and as a result, there is a much higher level of satisfaction with the government and a much higher level of cohesiveness. So it's interesting, policy decisions and how you deal with things and whether you prioritise relationships and make sure that people are integrated, or whether you keep people separate and treat them differently, can make a massive outcome even in countries with the same sort of starting point.
I mean, if I may continue on that, this is absolutely brilliant, because from my own personal life, the point you bring about integrating people has been something that has stayed with me, because I come from, well, for those of you who do not know Nigeria, Nigeria is a country that's in the west of Africa, and the population of Nigeria is estimated to be about 175 million people. We speak over 500 different languages. I'm not talking about dialects, I'm talking about languages, different languages. Now, that's a very, very, very diverse bunch of people, very, very diverse. In my area where I come from the Niger Delta, there are about 20 different groups of people. We're like a minority there. Now, what I found out, okay, so I continue. So I come from the southeast, the Niger Delta of Nigeria. Now, when I was growing up, Nigeria had this policy where they wanted people to mix because of the diversity. So they created a system where they created federal government colleges. And these colleges were such that, these colleges, they were secondary schools basically. Okay. The colleges were such that, or the secondary schools were such that people from different parts of the country went to other parts of the country just so that they would have this sense of unity, sense of being in Nigeria. And I was lucky enough to go to one of those schools because, and the school I went to was in the far northwest of the country, in a place called Sokoto, which is Muslim. I come from a Christian background. My parents were Christians, and like all of my family were devout Christians. So I was sent to school in the northwest, which is the other part. It's about almost 2,000 kilometers from where I was. I was 11 years old when I went there, and that was a Muslim place. Now, today I hear stories about Muslims this and Muslims that, and I always laugh, and sometimes it just makes me so upset because I dare ask anyone making those statements, do you know any Muslim? Have you lived with any Muslim? If you can answer those two questions and you still have a different, you're still of the same opinion, then I am willing to talk with you. If you have not, then what's happening is you're just going along with what everyone else is saying. Now, the importance of that is the issue that people have the opportunity to get to know each other. I lived in England as well, I lived in London. That was also an absolutely amazing experience for me because you got to meet people from every country in the world if you wanted to. It really was that simple. If you wanted to, you got, and the more you got to know about the people and the cultures, any prejudices you have just disappear. Then you begin to see people as just people. Now, you know, like when I left Nigeria, I must admit that I had the issue of color. Well, before I went to London, I knew about the diversity of people, and I accepted the diversity of people because I never saw anyone as different from myself. I really never did say. When I went to London, London just reinforced that such that I don't even see color anymore. I just see someone in front of me who has something to say to me.
I could continue with that Paul's, with my own experience. I did 2 years in Netherlands during my time. I did my dissertation, and first year I was living with the Surinamese family, with the mother who was victim of the Surinamese government. She was part of trade union, and there was of course the military government who had severe sort of human rights violations against people who were part of the trade union and 2 daughters, and it was for me as a Finnish person. You can understand that at those days there were quite few this sort of colored people here. So it really opened my eyes, and when you live here with this sort of family, you can really understand that there is no difference. But it takes that you meet these people and meet them in everyday life, not just in this sort of special occasions. Then you understand these sort of issues.
Do we have any other questions? There.
Hello. I would like to know if there would be a strong arguments for people with non-monotheistic backgrounds to rely on human rights.
That's a very good question. Oh my gosh.
We have this very strong argumentation for a Christian and Judaistic and overall monotheistic sustentation, but then how could we get people from other cultures to actually get into their in their everyday life to believe in human rights?
If I may dare to answer the question, to begin with, there's a basic assumption, I think this is working now. There's a basic assumption that probably people are not aware that there are human rights existing in other places. There's that assumption. If I understood your question correctly, you were sort of saying that how do we get people in those places to understand human rights? Well, I'll start by saying that instead, make the assumption that people are aware of what and how they would like to live their lives such that it is comfortable for them. That is something everybody understands. So regardless of what your religious beliefs are, people know what it takes for them to live comfortably. And I dare to say there is no one who would be willing not to live a comfortable life. Now, if we make that assumption and we start from that position, what we're saying is, once you can define that for yourself, what the human rights framework says is, you need to extend it to the next person. To say that that person too, just like myself, has the desire to lead a nice, comfortable life, regardless of what it is that they're doing. So this is not something that is based on... the other thing I think that also comes out from this is, there is this thinking that one group of people know and the other people do not know. No, I assume that everyone actually does know. And when you interact with people, you'd find out that people actually do know. So if you put it that simply, you know, the whole idea of human rights is very simple. I'm pretty sure there's no one that will come and say, I'd like to suffer. Well, maybe you might find one or two, but I don't know.
Three answers. The first one, Paul mentioned a little earlier, the Cyrus cylinder in 593 BC is an early example of people, of a ruler addressing the kinds of questions that human rights theory addresses today. Yeah, the questions have been there as long as there has been human civilization. Human rights theory is a particular way of answering those questions and concerns. There have been other ways in the past of doing it. So you would find, I think, in cultures, other ways of approaching it. The second point is, I think it's quite difficult within a polytheistic framework. I think it's probably no accident that India's caste system is tied up with the polytheism of Hinduism. But the third point I think I would make is I would not presume to know the answer to that kind of question. As Paul said, you need to have met some people who have those belief systems and have lived with some people who have those belief systems, and to ask them whether there are resources within their own tradition and culture, rather than presuming from the outside that we know what the answer is to how they get to those kinds of issues and answers.
I think one of the most difficult and thing in human rights law is to fight against this sort of cultural relativism. It's of course done by certain governments who have this sort of idea that there should be different kind of respect on certain rights because of the cultural heritage. And almost always there are something sinister behind, maybe controlling opposition or referring to these sort of cultural traditions which of course are not allowed according to religious documents. For instance, the most sinister is of course this sort of exploitation of females. It's not of course allowed despite of what people are saying. So these sort of issues, this sort of cultural relativism is at least where human rights, this sort of community has to be very strong and fight against these sort of ideas that there are these sort of issues which are due to culture different in certain parts of the world.
So I think we have to have our concluding statements now. So we could each have like 2 minutes just to conclude. What do you want us to remember from this
Where do we
session?
I don't know, I think David too. He's the guest, but we could give him the opportunity to.
Two points, one specific, one general. Freedom of speech was something that, and freedom of expression is something that Jukka has been working on. Really big issue at the moment. Voltaire said, "I disagree fundamentally with what you are saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thought. What do we do when what people are saying is completely offensive? Just a little bit of improvement for your English. To attack somebody on Twitter or social media is known in English as trolling, after the trolls, the Nordic monsters. So, something for you to bear in mind. More generally, don't leave human rights to the lawyers. Think about human rights. Think about why you believe in human rights, and think about what your obligations are to those around you.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if I could add to that. It's just the same message I've been saying, that this is something that belongs to all of us. And it is something that we have to be willing to defend, not just for ourselves, but for others. When we see someone that is put in a position where their abuses are under threat, we should be able to speak out. I know that this is something that is not a part of our culture here in Finland. The part of our culture is we try to keep ourselves to ourselves. But I think when things affect us, we should begin to learn to speak out and say, hey, this is not going the way it's going. And we have every possibility to do so right now. The policies that are being imposed on us are not policies that I think would be defending the rights of a lot of us, the majority of us. And if we don't say anything, the people making the policies would never know. I'm reverting now to my English and Nigerian roots. we need to be willing to say, and as has been said the whole evening, this is something that affects each and every one of us, and it's part of our everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you. I truly enjoyed this discussion with David and Paul, and I think we had this sort of united message about human rights, and it's about also this sort of message that it's not you cannot own human rights. No political party owns human rights. It's we human beings are all this sort of right holders of human rights, and it's important that this sort of message is when we polarize this society, we remember that there is something precious in this human rights, and we must not destroy this sort of achievement what we came after the Second World War. And it's in these sort of days, what we are living at this moment. These are the sort of important days. We have to be cautious. We have to be looking around what is happening, and really each of you should think about how this world is changing, and be you must be also ready to have this sort of voice, your own voice about human rights. That's one of the sort of important things, that it's part of your obligations to have this sort of human rights voice. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to join me in thanking our great speakers today? And if you like to continue the discussion with these gentlemen, I'm sure there's some opportunity for that after this event, maybe here, having coffee and tea, or perhaps at the after event at Katrina restaurant. And I forgot to mention at the beginning about those surveys that have been handed to you. If you didn't get one, there's probably more there. We'd like to hear from you. What did you think of this event? Let us know through those surveys, so perhaps in the future we can organize these events even better. So, thank you.
I think maybe if you give me the right to speak, I could speak on behalf of all of us. Yeah. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out this evening to come and participate in this. I think it is very, very important. I've enjoyed myself very, very much. And it's been down to your being here that the event has turned out to be what it is. So I'd like to really say thank you for coming down. Thank you.